Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Designing a Whole Child Accountability System. My name is Catherine Gewirtz, and I'm Associate Editor here at Education Week. I'm happy to be moderating today. Underwriting for the content of this webinar has been provided by the Atlantic Philanthropies, Novo Foundation, the Rakes Foundation, and the California Endowment. Just a couple of quick technical things before we get into the subject matter. We want this webinar to be an interactive experience, so please don't be shy about asking questions at any time. All you have to do is type into that little box on your screen that says, Ask a Question. If you're having any audio trouble, please check the audio setting on your computer, as well as your speaker volume settings. If you're still having trouble, see our audio troubleshooting file, which is in the Handouts folder at the bottom of this console. You'll see some other icons on the console that could be useful too. The bio panel lets you read about today's speakers. To download a copy of today's slides, click the Handouts panel. You can also follow the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag EWWebinar. Finally, an archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. Okay, with business out of the way, let's turn our attention to whole child accountability systems. You certainly do not need me to tell you that assessing what students know and holding schools accountable for good work has been a hotly debated topic ever since No Child Left Behind became law in 2002. Those conversations are particularly timely right now, as educators and communities debate what testing should look like and how good performance should be judged. Just this morning, Congress was debating new bills that could change the shape of testing and accountability as we've known it for the past 13 years. Our two guests today are working right at the heart of that debate and have interesting work to share with us about new ways to judge student and school performance. Our first guest, Josh Garcia, is the Deputy Superintendent of the Tacoma, Washington School District and, as you probably know by now, one of EdWeek's 2015 Leaders to Learn From. Josh and his team develop a whole child accountability system that judges schools by far more than just their test scores. He'll tell you what led to that system and about the wide range of metrics that Tacoma uses in sizing up schools. Our second guest, Jennifer Davis Poon, is the Director of the Innovation Lab Network at the Council of Chief State School Officers here in Washington, D.C. The 12 states in the Innovation Lab Network are exploring better ways to assess what students are learning and holding themselves accountable for success. Jenny will tell us how some of those states are pushing the envelope with new kinds of accountability metrics. Josh, why don't you get us started?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We're really excited to be a part of this conversation and share with you a little bit about the Tacoma Journey, which is using multiple measures to create a whole child accountability system. We put a lot of content in here for you and a lot of resources, knowing that you may want to glance at them, look at them at a later time. But we started with a very basic formula, which is defining what student success is, and we came up with a great, what we think is a great framework to operate from, which is access times equity times quality. And if you have a zero anywhere in that mathematical formula, you're not going to have student success. And what we really needed to do is start locally and define what we thought a whole child value education system was for our kids. And from there, we got clear about what that was. We developed intentional plans. We've worked those plans religiously and relentlessly since 2012. And we've monitored and adjusted based on feedback from our community, expertise from the field, and even our students. I mentioned earlier that we have a whole child framework. We have 41 indicators that are sliced and diced in various filters. But really the framework starts with the principles that every child should be healthy, engaged, safe, challenged, and supported. And we went through a process using a variety of community leaders, making sure that every citizen in Tacoma had access to provide feedback, and got clear about what would we use to define what it meant to be healthy. What would we use as a benchmark to define engagement, safety, rigor, and support. And you can see that complete list is right available through the hyperlink. And you'll find even there how we monitor that and additionally the action plans we use to move those benchmarks. I want to give a couple cautions if you're thinking about going about this work. Some things to consider, some lessons that we've learned is getting a community to define what success is for every child, not a few children, not the top 10%, not the top 20%, but what do you value as a community for every child in a measurable manner is extremely difficult. And we spent months going back and forth having to really push ourselves as the city and say, what is it that we want for every child and how will we measure it and how will we do it in a transparent manner so that we can be honest with each other about our successes and our downputs. We also found that technology and data systems in education are not aligned. Thus, the creation of historical data can be extremely challenging. And if you've spent any time with building data systems, you know everything's in a binary code, and it's either a 1 or a 0 on the back side of it. And so as you're developing your benchmarks and developing your measurements, it's a great opportunity to also explain to your community and your citizens and your staff is what is the limitations with the data. And that can be somewhat humbling as you go down this road. The last piece is, I would say, is the more clear that you can become about what you want for every child and then measuring that, it can be paralyzing for folks, community partners. You have to have different conversations about why are we partnering and is it working? And we agreed that this laser-like focus of success is really may need some additional conversations. It can be difficult for staff when they are being measured and saying you're not moving the needle by your efforts in your plans, and how are we going to adjust, or are you the right person to do that? So just a few cautions as we go through. As we dig into the weeds a little bit, the success comes through clarity. There's a snapshot here on the slide of just how we present the data, and if you went to our website, you'd be able to filter that based on ethnic codes, poverty, mobility, special ed, English language learners, other ethnic codes. But as I mentioned earlier, we really used what we called an accordion process, where we would take ideas, we would bounce them back out into the city and say, is this what you meant? Is this what it looks like? We then brought those recommendations to the board for adoption. That was really critical because we really know that once we're clear about what our goals are, it has so many other implications such as resource allocation, policy implications, a variety of other pieces. And then we had to build the infrastructure, the technology and communication and the professional development in order to implement the plans, monitor the plans, and discuss action steps. From there, we either had to create baseline data or establish baseline data based on the data that the benchmark specifically, that we were using. We established a regular monitoring report schedules, which we do twice a year, and it follows the same format, which is here's the data regarding a specific benchmark or a series of benchmarks, the lessons learned, and our next steps. And we do that twice a year so that we can see that we're building that progress. But also really important for the community to also have feedback and saying, you know, we saw that you did this, here's what we know, here's what the community partnerships are already doing this work, and how we can align our efforts so that we're providing 24/7 wraparound services for our kids. So each community, I think, has to wrestle around with why do you want to create something that's different from the status quo. And for us, it started with the need to understand that the success that we want for our children is not measured in a one-time test in English language arts and mathematics, that we wanted more for our children. And it wasn't the responsibility for policymakers to do that outside. It was the responsibility for the community to establish that first. And then we went through some other filters, which was really critical. Is we weren't going to ignore the state or federal mandates. We were going to build them in. But we could be responsible for holding ourselves more accountable. We needed to provide more transparency in our city for our failures and our successes. And our superintendent was crystal clear with her vision of there will be no warts that will not be shared, and the idea that if we're not doing the job, we're going to own that, we're going to work harder, and we're going to really create a culture of growth. We also knew that we had to do some work, and you'll see this highlighted hyperlink about budgeting priorities, is that if we valued certain aspects of or certain benchmarks for our kids, that we needed to provide resources to make sure that the staff had the support in order to move the needle in there. And then build trust, and then get clear about the alignment where our partners could help, and make sure that we weren't just taking a shotgun approach, if you will, towards providing resources and support, but very targeted support. And then that we were helping folks understand that our work in education is complex, and that having multiple measures is complex, but there are achievement gaps and not just a single achievement gap. I'm going to take you through one example on how we align policies, programs, and practice so that we would work through the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. And you can, as you go through these on your own, you may see that there was some things that maybe we should have had for a long time. But this clarity about success, specific benchmark, will allow us to go through that. So we started with a practice. Once we adopted the benchmarks, we went through and began doing policy gap analysis. And this is an ongoing process. There's a series of policies that have all started since this work around establishing a multiple measures accountability system. So our board was very clear about saying, so what are the barriers that are in your way in order to move the needle, which all of our benchmarks are measured on student outcomes. There's no adult outcomes. And so they said that their responsibility was to create either new policy or remove policies that were barriers. And here's a series of policies that have already been in the revised or created. The next piece was to really start to identify which programs we were going to support, and where were they aligned, and where were they repetitious, and how did we remove some of the waste, if you will. And not that we were creating a one-size-fits-all. We definitely believe in choice and foster and promote innovation, but that we really felt like that if they were our bread and butter to help move the needle in student achievement, they should have funding, they should have communication, excuse me, and they should really focus in on how we collectively work towards moving that needle. The practices implementation is, we know that we can have policies and programs, if you will, but there also has to be practices that promote and foster equity, because all does mean all in our city and in our school district. And so here's a series of practices that we had to examine. We do oftentimes do outside reports, meaning that we hire folks or we partner with folks to have them be a critical friend, if you will, and look at our practices and are they really meeting the needs of what we say we're sharing with our community and our action plans. And so here's a series of those practices that we've since implemented. So as we get down into even more specific one is one of our specific benchmarks is verified acceptance letters into either military, 2-year, 4-year university, or community college or technical college. So not what the student intends to do, but a verified acceptance letters. So the step one first was what are all of those barriers that can limit student access, in this example, to college? Qualification criteria, financial assistance, knowledge in college university system, and relentlessly work to move those barriers, and then we just simply repeat the cycle. Here's some of the qualification criteria that we established, and how do we remove the barriers. We removed cost barriers, we did policies, and then we really focused on the communication. And I'm going fast to make sure that we get through everyone else's. Here's some of the financial barriers, some pretty unique opportunities for kids in Tacoma, building with their partners, which are all grounded in formal MOUs, which is also another one of our benchmarks, partnerships specifically. And then you have removing some access barriers to the knowledge and the demystifying. Oftentimes in Tacoma we serve over 64% of our kids live in poverty. So we know that we play a critical responsibility, knowing that we're not the only adults that are responsible for raising our children, but that we do have a responsibility to communicate and demystify the system. Here's a couple of unique partnerships that are unique to our city with our higher education partners that really allow and foster us moving the needle on verified acceptance letters. And then we have to ask ourselves, is it working? Are we really doing what we say we're doing? And that's where the data has. But here's some small examples, large examples of some of the data that we've collected in the short amount of time that we feel like it's demonstrating that this system is a more representative of what we value for every kid and that our efforts are actually working. Finally, I'd like to conclude with a few lessons learned. If you're going in this, you don't really know what you don't know. So the journey of creating shared benchmarks, not only for staff but for community, is so critical to creating trust in the system. And oftentimes we find that schools are not trusted. Once we've created the systems, you have to be comfortable with the idea that you're going to have to change the way you're doing business. Like I mentioned, everything from policies to programs to communications to budgeting, these have an opportunity to change with your clarity about what you value for every child. And then most importantly, helping folks understand every day that every number represents a child and getting clear with when you move those numbers, it's not as simple as moving a percentage. You're actually changing lives and knowing how many lives behind each percentage point. And when you're doing that, I have to admit that I think what you'd ask educators in Tacoma, that's a pretty cruel and fun feeling.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. Jenny, why don't you tell us about some of the work your states are doing in the lab network?
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And thank you so much just for the opportunity to be on this presentation. And it's an honor to present alongside Josh. Josh, thank you so much for that look into your leadership and the model that you've developed in Tacoma. And so I'll try to come alongside that with just some national perspective, some thoughts on national trends and examples of innovation. And just by way of context, I'm the director of the Innovation Lab Network at the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is a nonpartisan national membership organization of state education agency commissioners, state superintendents, and so it's from that perspective that I'd like to share with you all today. So just to quickly outline my session goals, so here's what we're going to talk about. First of all, I'd like to help contextualize the idea of this whole child approach within both current context and some history of accountability reform to explore the benefits and the challenges to implementing such systems at a state level, specifically commenting on what are some of the reasons we don't see it more prevalent today, and then to identify some hopeful emerging state approaches and share some other useful resources. I also wanted to contextualize the conversation in the work of CCSSO's Innovation Lab Network, which, as Catherine mentioned, is a network of 12 states that are facilitated by CCSSO that came together around 2009, around the time of really thinking about higher standards for students, and really wanted to think about how do we redesign systems to better wrap around the needs of every learner. And so through shared collective learning and collective action, ILN states work with leading districts and schools to seed and spread transformative models and the policies and practices that support them. And so as the transformative work in these states became increasingly sophisticated, one common challenge that we kept hearing from the network was that the current systems of assessment and accountability don't really seem to align well with states' movement towards deeper measures of learning across the various domains and dimensions of college and career readiness. And that, they wanted to, while remaining committed to transparency, to equity, to making annual determinations of student progress, to providing information to parents, teachers, and students, interested in developing new systems that better align with this shift and thinking about student outcomes and the kinds of learning environments that deliver those outcomes. So I wanted to just spend briefly kind of talking about how we got to where we are with current accountability systems. And the current paradigm, as you all know, starts really with No Child Left Behind. This set the way we think about accountability systems today, where they're based on assessments of all students in all grades on mathematics, English language arts, and science, and requiring all schools and districts and states to report student progress both in aggregate and by subgroups. So this is kind of the system, the paradigm that we have today. In 2011, around the time of thinking about higher standards for students in the Common Core, as states were really raising the bar for education systems, states came together around a vision for accountability systems that are more directly aligned to college and career-ready expectations, that draw more meaningful distinctions among schools and districts for the purpose of intervention, and that provide more actionable data to stakeholders and allow for continuous improvement. And so states, with the Council of Chief State School Officers, articulated 9 principles of next-generation state accountability systems, which they then advanced either through state leadership through their Elementary and Secondary Education Act waivers and waiver renewals, or continued through state leadership and state system reform. Undoubtedly, these efforts have achieved better systems of accountability than we had before. But as states reflect on what has occurred, some find themselves asking whether they've achieved it all or whether there's still a need to further. Questions are, around, are the state systems in place? Do they provide the most meaningful measures of what students know and are able to do in order to be college and career ready? Have we achieved what we wanted with regard to reporting data that's instructionally relevant and that provides the kind of transparency to students and parents that Josh was describing? Do systems align with classroom practices that may be more responsive to student needs, such as competency-based education? Or do they sometimes present barriers to innovations in teaching and learning? And so it's this kind of self-reflection, aided in no doubt by recent interest in reauthorizing NCLB, as Catherine mentioned, that has led to an increasing number of states to think about what the next version of accountability, or as we're calling it here, accountability 3.0 might look like. And so what does 3.0 look like? So through our conversations and interactions with leading states, a couple of themes have emerged that describe what may be considered the start of a new wave of accountability reform. We call these big bets for transformation to accountability 3.0, and these include things like strengthening a focus on defining desired outcomes, not just as, good scores on ELA and math tests or ACT or whatever it may be, but explicitly signaling desired outcomes, as Josh and his district did, as the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that result in college and career readiness. Improving systems of assessment to better measure college and career readiness, either statewide or through pilot processes, including multiple measures of college and career readiness in accountability systems, providing greater space for local innovation through district flexibility, and then thinking about better ways of using data, either through multiple measure dashboards, diagnostic review processes, and in the same way improving interventions and focusing on continuous improvement. It's really the first three that I think we're going to focus on primarily today, which is really strengthening the way we think about college and career-ready outcomes, improving systems of assessment to measure those, and including multiple measures and accountability. So, as a wise man named Josh Garcia once said, start with the end in mind. And so that's really where the Innovation Lab Network began these conversations and really thinking about what do we mean when we say college and career-ready outcomes. And so through the work with the Education Policy Improvement Center, ILM states identified specific kinds of skills within 3 domains of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that we consider essential to students' college and career readiness. And so knowledge includes mastery of rigorous content and its application or transfer. Skills would be those capacities and strategies that enable students to learn and engage in higher order thinking and meaningful interaction and planning for the future. And then dispositions are what some might call socio-emotional skills, work-study practices, habits of mind, other behaviors that associate with success in college, career, and citizenship. And this was backed by an extensive research framework looking at what skills actually are known to associate with both K-12 and post-secondary outcomes through current research. So this is what the island in 2013 issued as its definition. There's a link at the bottom where you can read our paper on it. But of course, it's not just as easy as creating the definition. As Josh mentioned, considerable, I think, work still needs to be done in order to operationalize such a vision into a system of whole child accountability. I think my slides might be loading. There it is. So what are some challenges then to including, measures of these knowledge, skills, and dispositions into accountability systems? And so I've outlined four, and in the remainder of my time, I'll just touch briefly on a couple of promising state examples and other resources that may show the way forward. And the four challenges, first of all, figuring out what to measure. Josh noted it takes really getting stakeholders together to agree on what are the measures that will be included in the system, what will be common across the state, what will be local, what processes will guide the selection of indicators that might trigger greater interventions. In other words, you don't want to end up with a system where, if you've got a fantastic arts program, you're off the hook, even if your kids aren't excelling in mathematics or critical thinking. So what are the indicators that would be the triggers for greater intervention? Once you've decided what to measure, this tricky challenge of how to measure it comes into play, especially when thinking about those skills and dispositions, those domains where it might be a little bit harder to find valid and reliable ways for various purposes of measurement and accountability. Then the last two are really on once you have determined how you're going to measure what you're going to measure, there are questions on how to report that information and then how that information triggers additional comprehensive supports. So how will multiple measures be reported at various levels of the system? How will they be aggregated and compared, especially if we're talking about local data? How will they be compared across the state? How will state data be shared for local use? And how will benchmarks and targets be set? And then how can states support local capacity building so that the data truly does drive continuous improvement? So on the first of what to measure, just a couple quick state examples of states really paving the way forward. So Kentucky, their accountability system not only includes a variety of learning outcomes, achievement, gap growth, college and career readiness, and graduation rates, but also measures of program quality and teacher effectiveness. This is their unbridled learning accountability model. New Hampshire is interesting because they've defined competencies not only in core subjects, but also cross-curricular skills and work-study habits, and a new pilot initiative called the Performance Assessment of Competency Education Initiative, which has been conditionally approved by the U.S. Department of Education, will allow the state to pilot common performance-based assessments of these competencies as an integral feature of the state's assessment and accountability system. Maine has defined standards in content areas and cross-curricular skills and requires students to demonstrate, again, competency or mastery of these skills in each of these skills in order to earn a diploma. And California is an interesting example because their new local control accountability plans require districts to define metrics for accountability that align to 8 state priorities, which you can see there, very diverse kinds of priorities. And this, one thing to note is that this system is currently separate from the state's annual performance index, which is used for accountability determinations and interventions, but the state is actively exploring how to better merge the two into one coherent system. So those are some examples of states really taking leaps forward in thinking about what to measure beyond math and ELA. I wanted to also talk about the challenge of how to measure once you've decided what to measure. It's much easier to write down the outcomes that you're interested in, but much harder to develop them in students and to assess student progress in ways that are valid and reliable for accountability purposes. So one thing I did want to point out is that in addition to the performance-based assessments being piloted by New Hampshire, The Innovation Lab Network is also undertaking work to help both policymakers and teachers better understand how key skills and dispositions develop and how they might potentially fit within an assessment paradigm. The work is being led by the Center for Innovation in Education at the University of Kentucky and the Education Policy Improvement Center. And the process is kind of a two-part process. We're working across states to first identify and vet research-based developmental progressions from novice to expert for a small number of priority skills and dispositions, and I'll show you what those are on the next slide. And then having developed those progressions, that framework of understanding how these skills and dispositions develop over time, they're working with states to rapid prototype the instructional and assessment tools while at the same time also developing policy recommendations. And so why the idea is that, if skills and dispositions are to take greater prominence as key outcomes for the education systems, well, one, we need to know how to actually develop these skills and dispositions in students. We can't just throw it out as an outcome but not actually focus on it in the classrooms. And secondly, policymakers need a better understanding of how these skills and dispositions can appropriately fit into assessment and accountability systems. So the 4 skills and dispositions that have been included in phase 1 of this project are collaboration, creativity, communication, and self-direction, which includes time management, organization, and goal setting. And on my next slide, this is a draft example of what a developmental progression might look like. This is a progression for self-direction, and each of the 4 skills and dispositions on the previous slide are actually broken down into subcomponents. So this is the goal setting and planning subcomponent of the self-direction developmental progression, and you can kind of see it may be too small to read on the slide, but it describes what that skill looks like as a beginner, an advanced beginner, a strategic learner, and an emerging expert. Okay, I know I'm supposed to be wrapping up soon, so I'll go very quickly through the rest of this. So that was what to measure and how to measure. This last slide is just about how to, report that information and support districts and support schools in continuous improvement. So just 2 quick examples. Colorado, in order to foster cycles of continuous improvement, provides data, state data, to schools and districts use this as part of a required annual improvement planning process. They have a really advanced data visualization tool that they provide that actually supports districts in looking at the data, and for their lowest performing districts, the Department of Education actually provides technical assistance. California is another example that's just formed a new entity to oversee and support the district's local control accountability plan implementation, and they're involved in helping to review those plans, evaluate progress against performance targets, and provide technical assistance when performance falls short. I'll leave you with just a couple of resources that I wanted to point out. One is a new resource that CCSSO has just issued, which is intended to help states really think through these complex issues in evolving coherent systems of accountability aligned with, whole child accountability, or what we're calling the 3.0 model, and helping states to do that while remaining committed to equity, transparency, and high expectations, but still providing space for innovation and continuous improvement. The resource is just released on our website. The link is at the bottom of the slide, and it's oriented as a decision framework that kind of takes states through the key questions, potential options, considerations, and some state examples along a variety of tasks, from defining expectations of learning, selecting and validating assessments, determining how assessments factor into accountability, and determining how that accountability data is used for supports, intervention, and continuous improvement. Very last thing, I promise, Catherine, I apologize. I want to note that we have an upcoming webinar on this resource and these topics, so the information will be in the slide deck. Please do use the link below to register. There are references, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. let's get to some questions. We have a lot of them, and the overwhelming majority are aimed at finding out more about what's going on in Tacoma. I do want to say that a lot of the questions are about what metrics Tacoma uses. What exactly are you measuring and how? We could not fit all of their metrics on 1 or 2 slides, and so you might go back in Josh's presentation on, I think it's slide 7. He has a link there that will take you to the complete list of what is measured in Tacoma. I'm sorry we couldn't get that on a slide for you, but it is there. Click on it and you'll see all the metrics. So with that in mind, let's just go to the other questions that have been coming in. And like I said, most of them are for Josh. So Josh, someone is asking, what assessment tool do you use to measure your whole child outcomes?
So we don't assessment systems. We use a variety of assessments, if you will, based on the specific benchmark. And so when we talk about rigorous coursework, we talk about, or rigorous classes, rigorous curriculum, we measure based on coursework and then the exams associated with those coursework. If we're talking about reading scores, we use we're in the Smarter Balance Assessment System, and previously State WASL HISP, but we also use classroom grades that are linked specifically to standards. So we have a standards-based report card. I think when we think about the next generation of accountability systems, I'd really encourage us all to be thinking about, instead of a single grade for a school and accountability system, moving more towards that standards-based report card method, recognizing that there are various factors in there. And I know there's a number of folks that are having conversations about what does that mean, how do we measure that. ASCD has forums on the next generation accountability system. We as educators, we as people that care about the whole child, we have to get really clear very quickly about what are those measurements, what are the assessment systems that we want, that we can agree to, what needs to be standardized nationally at the state level, and then what can be added locally. And so my final comment to that is you have to start with what is the benchmark and then see what is the data available, what are the tools available, not starting with what is the tool.
Gotcha. Good point. Thank you. Jenny, please, I encourage you to jump into, even though almost all of these questions are aimed at more figuring out more about what Tacoma is doing, if there's any of your states that have experience that are pertinent to the question, just jump in. I welcome you to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to aim these at Josh. The next question, Josh, is in what way does your whole child approach take into consideration issues of race, class, language, and immigrant status?
You bet. Great question. It was one of our guiding principles is when we talked about all. Tacoma is a port city, approximately 80 different languages spoken, first-generation languages spoken in our schools on any given day. And so when we think about the whole child, we have to look at it from each one of those lenses. And if you got online and you went to our strategic plan website or our main page and said, how are we doing, you would be, as a community member, be able to filter based on each one of those criteria or those demographic labels, if you will, and saying, how are the kids in our city doing in, for example, Hispanic kids in rigorous coursework? How many are taking that? What does that look like? What is the action plan? So you'll see in our action plans and our monitoring reports, how are we addressing that? And so there's individual projects that are associated with that. So we look at, for example, we have the Traditional Black Male Learners Project that a gentleman named Mr. Patrick Johnson is leading in our district, talking about reading at early grade levels and what are the resources and materials. So specific action plans, so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's what makes it so complex. And that goes back to that point, is there's no such thing as an achievement gap. There's achievement gaps. And it's really important that we continue to remember that. I can go into more details on the specific plans, but it would start with the benchmark.
Good, thank you. Now, here's a question about how, once again, that tough stuff about how you measure something. Someone's calling attention to the fact that a number of the metrics measure, for instance, the number of participants in activities, like after-school activities or whatever. She says, what about the quality of those activities? How do you measure that? Well,
we have the ability with ours, so publicly we can filter and we can share that data, and then we have the ability to drill each one of those benchmarks down to the specific school, to the specific classroom, and to the specific student. And so we have a team of folks that is constantly looking at the correlations between certain programs and the achievement to other benchmarks. I think it's also a dangerous judgment call that we want as society to say, well, this one's better than this one. Well, I think then I would push that local community to define and say, so is there only one way to get there, or is the outcome what we're measuring our success by? And in our community, we said we're going to start with the outcome is the participation in there. By no means do we think as a city and as a school district that we knocked it out of the park and we did it completely right the first time. And if you jumped on our district webpage right now, you'd see that we're going through a process where we're asking that community feedback again, is what do we need to adjust? And so this isn't a destination about accountability systems. This is about an ongoing journey. But we're constantly looking at quality, including at what cost. And that's where our business folks have really helped lead us to say, yeah, this is a great program, but what's the cost analysis that's in place for this after-school program? For example, if it's costing a lot of money and it's serving a small group of kids, not only which group of kids, is it only white middle-class students, upper middle-class students, or is it targeted towards a traditionally vulnerable population? And those are tough decisions that we have to make as a community, as a board on a regular basis.
Great, thank you. So here's a question about some of your metrics are about services that lie outside the schoolhouse. So one of the questions is, how have you connected children and families to resources and opportunities traditionally outside the public schools? What did you bring into the schools? What infrastructure have you used or built?
So we've also partnered with what we have a community foundation and working with Collective Impact. So parallel time frames, we worked with them to create similar community benchmarks. And so the Foundation for Tacoma Students has community indicators. And we spent a lot of time making sure that those indicators were aligned. And we took this philosophy about trying to reduce waste or redundancy in the system, meaning the system, meaning our culture. And so we have agreements that we don't offer duplication of services. And so each schoolhouse, so we have approximately 55 different schools, individual school codes in Tacoma. And we start with a project called asset mapping as we go through, and we talk about resource allocation, and we say, we put the school in the middle of the neighborhood, and we say, what's around there? What are the services available? What are the after-school programs? What are the healthcare programs? What are the library services? All within that. And then we start to ask ourselves, do we need to duplicate that? Is there an access gap barrier there? What can we use? And then we go to the community and ask, how do we enhance our neighborhoods by adding programming to the school? And then we build business models and partnerships to remove costs on both ends. So if we bring in services from the outside the school into the school, we really, if it is moving and targeted towards a specific benchmark, we remove the financial barriers for those programs to exist so that the schools become 24/7, 365-day hubs. Comprehensive health services down to basic programming, which is adult education.
Great. Jenny, we have a question for you on the broader national context for all of this work, and that is, do you see more states being able to establish these broader accountability systems without reauthorization of ESEA, or is replacing NCLB a key condition for more widespread innovations like this?
That's a great question. I think any state would want to see ESEA reauthorized, in a way that we have a stable framework within which states can innovate. So I think, for CCSSO, that's certainly priority number one. I think in absence of that, sure, states can move forward. States can work either within waivers or continue working within their own systems. But I think some states have noted that in the current paradigm, there are maybe conflicts of what they are signaling as important or conflicts in the kinds of assessment that they want to be giving versus are needing to be giving at the moment. So I do think innovation can continue in either case, but certainly a new paradigm for ESDA that would allow for innovation within guardrails so that there are assurances of equity and fairness in the system would be preferred.
Thank you. Josh, here's a question. This is interesting. How has the data that you've collected through Whole Child changed your view of which schools are strong versus which need support and intervention?
Oh, dramatically. And I think it's also helped build more of a community-wide conversation. So when a lot of ours were able to specifically look at growth and growth index. And so even using standardized test scores, we're having conversations with schools that are traditionally being deemed as highly successful, where there may be very little growth actually happening within the students. And other schools that are deemed as failing schools have tremendous growth. And unfortunately, those growth with the we have some middle schools, for example, where they're serving very traditionally vulnerable populations in very tough neighborhoods, and those kids are growing at an accelerated rate. Unfortunately, they're not at the same level, but they're growing faster, and the data has really dramatically changed the conversation. It's also changed the conversation around collaboration to say, what is this team of educators, classroom teachers, principals, support staff doing at this building? What is their intentional plan? And what resources are there, and what are we allocating to support and foster that, which has really created a culture of innovation. We have one specific high school. We have numerous examples, but Lincoln High School 2.0, where we found that by extending the day, kids were engaging in more rigorous classes. Graduation rates were climbing pretty dramatically, and as a result of that, we went from a cohort model where to approximately 200 kids were involved to a school-wide model where there are 1,400 kids involved in an extended day program. So it's not only changing the way we look, it's changing the business plans and the practices, and saying if it was working there, will it be sustainable and replicable in other areas of town?
Okay. What about music classes and visual and performing arts and things like that, Josh? Someone's wondering if those factor into Tacoma's idea of a successful school.
Absolutely. So I go back to is not everything that is measured is the most important things, and not everything that's not measured is not important. And so we value those opportunities. And this idea of clarity is around the outcomes that we want for kids that we've agreed to the first round, and we will continue to revise those. What we've really guarded against is saying that there's only one way to do that. And so it's really fostered this culture of innovation, and we have actually a whole process where you can propose schools as well as individual programs on how to get kids to those benchmarks. And so we have schools centered around the arts, centered around specific content areas or thematic approaches, but the outcome for kids as measured and defined by our community is the same. And so it's really been fascinating to see how creative educators and community members have been to say that things like the arts are critical. We have a plan for how we want to implement them in a unique and creative way. We support that. In addition to that, we support district-wide programs of the arts to make sure that every kid has access. So even if it's not a part of the basic framework of that school, there is an opportunity and value to that.
Great. Jenny, at the risk of asking you a question and then saying you can't have forever to answer it, because this is seems like would need to be a long answer for all the nuance. Someone does want to know, what are some examples of valid and reliable ways states can measure dispositions?
Well, I think I'll avoid the lengthy answer by saying that's precisely what we're trying to develop, what we're trying to determine through the pilot process that the Center for Innovation in Education and the Education Policy Improvement Center are working on. I know that others are working on developing tools as well that could potentially assess these, and there are also some who want to see these dispositions not explicitly measured, but actually embedded within performance-based assessments that are tied to content. That's, for example, what New Hampshire has been working on. So I think there are a couple ways that people are working on developing valid and reliable assessments of skills and dispositions, but I think the fact that this is still a work in progress is one of the primary reasons why you don't see this more commonly incorporated into state accountability systems already.
Mm-hmm. Josh, someone is asking, do all of the indicators roll up into a single score? Wait a second, I lost that question. Do all of the indicators roll up into a single score that's used for review and accountability to give an indicator of overall school, quote, health? Or are decisions in review always involving review of the multiple metrics?
The multiple, and we feel passionate that it should be there. It kind of goes back to what we've learned in education about grades, and the difference between a one grade and a standards-based grading philosophy is we want to be extremely transparent with our community about where we are with every one of our agreed benchmarks. And it's critical that we help folks understand that that you can't have a single grade and truly get clear about are kids safe and engaged and challenged and supported and healthy based on your local definition. And if we value all of those, and whatever community values that are at the local level should be reported on a level playing field.
Can you talk a little bit about how teachers are reacting to these metrics? I mean, it wouldn't be too hard to imagine that there would be some objection or at least some lively debate about, you know, this is something that's too hard to measure, you're not measuring this accurately, or I shouldn't have to be held accountable for that kind of thing. So what's the range of teacher reaction to all of this?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to note we have world-class educators here in Tacoma, and that's exciting, and I think a lot of communities do. When you look at our benchmarks, a lot of folks would imagine, say, well, yeah, that's just good common sense. So we shouldn't measure the progress of our report card standards in the areas of mathematics and reading as a balanced way to look at standardized test scores. So we've really tried to use things and indicators, and what the approach is what resonates from the boardroom to the living room. What is the family value? What is the educator in the classroom value? What is the school value? And not take something and plop it into the system. And so that's one of the things that I would really encourage folks. I think that all of your benchmarks should have to address state and federal accountability systems, but you really have to define those at a local level in order to truly get clear about the success of your school.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that's kind of related to that, but it's about the broader community as well as also this questioner includes principals. What process was used to build general acceptance of the local system? Have all campus principals been accepting of the results?
Well, I think it would be naive for them to, for me to say everyone is fully embraced. The process that we use, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is an accordion process. Everyone in the system, meaning educators, community-based organizations, teachers, students, has an opportunity to provide their feedback, and not once, but multiple times through their development and revision. And what we do is we collect that feedback, we look for trends, we push that back out to all the constituents and say, what do you think about this? And it goes back 3 to 4 times, back and forth, until we bring that to the board for recommendations. This latest iteration is we're getting some pushback even in saying, well, why are we asking the community first about what modifications should we make? And we're asking everyone at the same time. And technology can play a role in that. And from there, we'll bring that into small group discussions, large group discussions. Our principals have numerous opportunities to discuss the flaws, the limitations of the system, as well as the strengths. And what we're finding overwhelming is it's better than what the status quo is. It may not be perfect, and we have to, as I think, profession, get very comfortable that in a short amount of time, even with the idea of reauthorization, is we may not all agree on every aspect, but is this a better system in the next generation accountability system than what we currently have.
Okay. Now here's a question that it'd be nice to hear from both of you. Jenny, if you feel any of your states or the core district's experience pertains to this, please jump in. The question is, how applicable do you think the Tacoma system is to other communities or districts, given the amount of effort and community involvement that are necessary?
When I read Jenny's slides and the work that she's doing, and there's some very key pieces there of the 4 pieces of what to measure, how to measure. Forgive me, I don't have them all in front of me. And I think that's the replicable approach. I think that people could look at the Tacoma model and say, what do we like? But they should ask themselves, so what does that mean for our community? And not cut and paste. I think there is a role for state and federal level to look at how do we provide a consistent framework, knowing that our populations are becoming more and more mobile across the nation. But that should not be the sole definition. They should play one piece of the larger accountability system. So I'd be interested in Jenny's answer as well, but I feel pretty passionately that their framework is aligned with our local interpretation.
Yeah, I agree, Josh, and I think that especially the process that you articulated around, think about the benchmarks first, then the measures, bring stakeholders together, have that agreement, work on it religiously, as you said. I think that is the replicable model. And to the point about the amount of effort required, no doubt. For example, in New Hampshire, they've spent the better part of a decade developing a system that is now being officially piloted in just 4 districts with a 6-year plan to expand across the state, with lots of investment from the state in building capacity in districts, in the pipeline, districts who will be piloting in the future. It does take a lot of effort, but it's the right effort. It's a community involvement, bringing teachers together, teacher professional development effort. There's so much, but it's the right effort to get at the right measures so that we have ourselves held accountable to the right things.
Okay, spinning off of a question that was submitted, I wanted to ask both of you, what are the most significant pitfalls that come to mind when you think about communities embarking on this process of identifying what's important to them and figuring out how to measure it? What are the couple of things that they need most to guard against or be wary about when they set to work on this?
Jenny, you want to go first? Or
Take it away, Josh.
I think I don't know if I describe them as pitfalls, but it is very difficult. I mean, we're a city of over 200,000 citizens. It's getting 5 people to agree on the same thing is a lot of work, and you have to be patient. You have to understand that this isn't just your decision. There are plenty of benchmarks that the internal team said, yeah, but maybe not. But you have to be vulnerable enough to say that it's not about us. It's about putting this child in the beginning and saying, what do we value? You have to be prepared that some people don't really want a solution. They just want to say that it's not good enough. It's not good enough. And so filtering through and really listening to that feedback, but also identifying who in the community is willing to roll up their sleeves and continually say, no, we need to get better. We need to get better. And we have some great citizens that are what we call critical friends. They point out the flaws. And sometimes that can get tiring. But at the same time, there's a commitment to saying that these are our kids. They're not the school's kids and they're not the city's kids. These are our kids. And so stamina, get comfortable with being vulnerable, and at the same time, make sure that you're constantly representing that the success of the students is a true reflection of the city's efforts, not just one individual or one school or anything. We have the kids less than a third of the time. The city has them for over 2/3 of the time.
I'll just add quickly to that from the state perspective. I think the pitfall to avoid from the beginning is thinking about how you frame this effort not as a step away from accountability or away from some of the gains that we've made in ensuring equity and civil rights, but that this is really about greater transparency, better aligned assessments, better information on what students know and are able to do, and reporting in a way that allows for more actionable response to identified needs. And so it's really important that that's at the heart of the approach and that it's not stepping away from accountability.
Well said, Jenny.
Well said, both of you. And I hate to end this. I feel like we could sit here for another hour. There's certainly plenty of questions, and it's completely fascinating. But we do have to wrap up. We've taken up the hour. So I want to thank our presenters, Josh Garcia and Jenny Davis-Poon, and all of you participants for making this a great discussion. As we said earlier, an archive of today's discussion and the PowerPoint slides will be available